Welcome to Medium in Conversation. I'm Amy Shearn, Senior Editor at Medium, and I'm here with Susan Orlean, award-winning author of 8 books, including The Orchid Thief and The Library Book, and staff writer for The New Yorker, who also writes frequently for Medium. Hi, Susan. Thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I'm here in dark and stormy noir era New York City. Well, you look like you're in a magical fairyland.
I'm in Los Angeles and it happens to be an incredibly beautiful day. So I would say this is as magical as LA is. It's a perfect day.
That's how it always is there, right? I think that's right.
A lot of the time, yes, I have to admit it. It is many days that are like this. So part of the challenge is to not look at every nice day and think, I don't want to sit in front of my desk. I need to go take advantage of this beautiful day. Which is
really sorry for you. That sounds like a great struggle.
It can be at times.
Thanks so much for being here. When I told people I was talking to you tonight and asked what they wanted to hear you talk about, one thing came up the most. Can you guess what it was?
No.
It was fennel seeds. People wanted to talk about fennel seeds. But we don't have to, unless you want to.
Oh, that's really funny. I wasn't going to make that guess. But I'm happy to discuss them.
I think we can just agree they're not candy.
They're not candy. They're a vegetable, actually.
There's something that we don't.
Well, they are when they're coated with enough sugar that they are technically a candy, but I feel like when you want candy, that is not what you had in mind.
I think that's exactly correct. All right, well, that's all I have. Thanks so much. No, I have a couple other questions. I'm wondering how you got to this moment. Did you always know you wanted to be a writer? Did you picture yourself writing the kinds of books that you've written? Have you always been so interested in telling people's stories?
I always wanted to be a writer. And it's really funny because, you know, I think that there's probably a huge range of people who become writers much to their surprise, or people who want to be writers and don't end up doing it. But it's what I always wanted to do from the time I was really young. And there was never a point where there was something else that I thought I would do. I remember going to my high school reunion and having someone at the reunion say to me, "You're the only person I know who ended up doing what everyone thought they would do." You know, that I wanted to be a writer when I was in high school, and I ended up being a writer. So it is kind of surprising. Sometimes I wonder whether it's the lack of imagination, that this was something that I knew existed and I never imagined any other path, or whether more affirmatively it was something that I was always drawn to. I always knew that it interested me, and I always felt passionate about it. You know, to the second part of your question, I think that I always wanted to write nonfiction. I knew I love reading fiction. I do it. That's the bulk of my reading is fiction. But from the time that I was able to sort of articulate a desire to be a writer, the kind of writer I wanted to be was a nonfiction writer who wrote long pieces about things that interested me. So not only did I end up becoming the thing I sort of imagined I would become, but I've ended up doing the kind of work within that genre that I sort of dreamed that I would do.
That's kind of incredible. Maybe that's the real secret to being a writer, just don't have a backup plan. And then you just have to be a writer, I guess.
Well, I think that there's some truth to that. I mean, when I was graduating from college, my parents really pressured me to go to law school, and they knew I wanted to be a writer, but they thought, well, this way you'll have a fallback. And I think intuitively, I knew that having a fallback that had a more predictable path would be would become not the fallback. It would become the thing I do, because if I went to law school, then I would be qualified to be a writer, and I mean a lawyer, and there was a very clear path, and there were jobs, and there were, it was so clear how to follow that path. Being a writer, I knew was going to be harder, and I don't think I specifically wanted to make it harder for myself, but I really felt that having a fallback would make it awfully easy and awfully tempting to give up when things were tough. And it's not the easiest profession to get traction in. You go through a long period of sort of clawing your way into the profession of being a writer, and it would have been very easy to bail, except I had no other skills.
Thank goodness you didn't have a law degree. See?
Nothing. I had nothing. I mean, I'm a very good typist and I was a good waitress, but I had no other training that would have qualified me to do anything else.
That's so interesting. Did you ever have moments maybe earlier in your career where you did consider quitting, or where you thought, this is crazy, this is not going to work, or projects that you felt like bailing on but couldn't?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think I ever seriously considered taking another path, even when it was tough. I never, I don't even remember having the thought cross my mind, which is kind of interesting, because there were certainly times where it felt really like a slog, and where I had great ambitions, but I was moving slowly towards them. But there was never a moment where I thought, oh, maybe I should really consider another way of making a living. I never did. I guess I'm lucky in that regard, that even when it was tough, I had enough confidence that it would work out, that I never thought, well, this isn't happening. I've really got to figure out, I've got to go back to school, or I need to look into some other way of making a living.
That's so interesting that you say that, because you've written for Medium about having creative self-doubt and about how to work through it. I loved your piece, Writing is a Nightmarish Hellscape, which probably the best headline ever, in which you write about how hard it feels, even for you, even having written so many books and written so many, long form pieces, and attaining so much success as a writer, how it still feels hard every time you start. And do you feel like you know why this is? Like, do lawyers sit down to do whatever lawyers do and go, I can't do it this time? Like, why? What is that?
I think there's a very good reason for it, which is I do think experience does count for something with writing. There's no question that it gets easier the more experience you have, even if it's merely a matter of saying, oh, I know this. I know that this feels really hard right now, but eventually it'll feel a little easier. I mean, you learn how to clock your own reactions very well. but every sentence is brand new.
Mm-hmm.
Every piece is brand new. You really don't build equity. You build experience. You build relationships with editors. You learn some of the mechanical parts of writing. You get better at. I mean, I've gotten much better at editing myself. I've gotten better. There's no question. But every sentence is invented new. And the fact, and for me in particular, because I never write about the same subject more than once. So I learn everything there is to learn about orchids, and then I write my book and I will never use that information again. So it's not only that the writing is new, but for me, even the information is new. That I begin a new project and I don't know anything about it and I have to start all over again. So I think that I do think that as much as there's a lot of craft in writing, it's primarily an art. I don't think a painter looks at a blank canvas and thinks, oh, I did a painting last week that was really good, and so this will be easy. I think it begins as a new challenge every time. And and sometimes that challenge is even greater because you don't want to repeat yourself, or you feel like there's an expectation after you've achieved a certain amount of stature that you will continue doing work at a certain level. So there's the whole emotional side of it that's very challenging. And I don't think that ever really goes away.
Yeah, right. Uh, that's interesting. I mean, you also write about sort of the weird mystery of coming up with ideas. And I love um, what you said about, not wanting to repeat yourself. And it certainly is tempting, right? Especially in the world of publishing. Like if you were to say, hey, I've got a great story about, a rose smuggler, I'm sure it'd be really easy to, sell that book and get everyone on board. But of course, because you're an artist, you want to do something new, you want to follow your curiosity, you want to keep yourself engaged and interested. But how you've written about sort of the weird mystery of coming up with ideas. Can you talk a little bit about if there's something like a little bit kind of magical or a little hard to quantify about how one comes up with an idea?
I think that it is sort of magical. I think it's probably most analogous to falling in love. There's so many people in the world. There are millions of people. You encounter millions of people in the course of your daily life, and yet why do you fall in love with someone and click with someone? I mean, there's some sort of chemistry that you can't ever reverse engineer. You can't explain it. Even when it happens, you can't say, well, this makes sense because. And I do think story ideas are very much like that. In the course of a day, you encounter all sorts of things that for one person might yield a story. For someone else, it's just they're just walking down the street and encountering whomever, and none of those things kind of click in a way that makes you think, whoa, that's a great story idea. And I would say much of the time, the experience that I have is truly serendipitous. I'm not looking for a story, and I will stumble on something and it just, there it is. And I feel like, how did that happen? Now, someone else might look at that same thing and think, that's not a story. That's a, you know, in the case of like the Orchid Thief, I saw a little short piece in a Miami newspaper. Someone else might have read that and thought, weird. I mean, and I'm saying another writer could have easily read that and just didn't feel that chemistry. I read it. Can I just say why? I'm not sure why. I definitely wasn't interested in orchids. I didn't think that I wanted to spend much time writing about Florida. I knew nothing about the sort of backstory of what was happening, but it just stuck in my head. And for whatever reason, to me, it instantly was the story I needed to be working on. Now, there are times when you're trying to think of a new idea and nothing seems to be clicking, and you do look at your old stories and think, well, why can't I just take something sort of similar and write, you know, that'll sort of save me from the trouble of trying to come up with another idea. But that often doesn't work. I mean, it feels very flaccid. It's like, yeah, it kind of works, but it's not, I'm not really excited about it. It doesn't feel organic. And I do think a story idea that you choose has this feeling of, it's like a folk melody. The minute you hear it, it's as if it always existed. The minute you come up with the story idea, it feels instantly like, well, of course it's a story idea. And of course that's what I'm going to be working on. The trouble is, I mean, first of all, there's a certain amount of your professional life where you are given assignments and not choosing your own stories. So there are plenty of times where you are obligated to go do a story that you've been told to do. And that's a whole other skill, which is how to find some component of an assignment that can get you excited in that same way. But the trick to generating new ideas is it's a pretty mysterious process. And the best you can do is expose yourself to as much as you possibly can, because the odds are something that you'll get exposed to will click and make you think, oh, that's a great story idea. So when I'm really stuck, I just feel like I have to get out of my office. I've got to look at a bunch of newspapers and magazines. I have to be out in the world. I just have to open myself up to as many possibilities as I can. And, you know, odds are pretty good that something will click. And I mean, I guess to go back to the dating analogy, if you sit in your office, you're probably not going to fall in love. You have to go to parties or have people fix you up or get on a dating app. You need to be exposed to lots of people in order to increase the statistical likelihood that you will fall in love.
Okay, Susan, geez, this is an intervention.
This is the dating advice as well as writing conversation. So
it's really, it's the whole gamut. Everything anyone needs, they can get right now from
right here. Medical advice, anything.
That's right. Next, we'll get to like soft tips. We'll get there. I love the idea of staying open to possibility, and the way it is just like falling in love, the thing that you find when you're not looking for anything in particular, a great story, the right match. And I loved too what you said about how once you get that idea and it clicks, there's that urgency. And isn't there, I feel like there's that weird sense too, where it seems very inevitable. and like, I know I then have that moment where I'm like, everybody must be writing this because it's so obviously the only interesting thing. And you
Right,
start getting to that magical thinking where everything seems related to the thing you're writing.
right.
But he sees it.
Oh, absolutely. And it's very funny because you do feel it's a subject that seemed absolutely invisible. So it's like when you buy a blue car and you suddenly feel like, well, wait a minute, everybody has a blue Volkswagen. There's so many of them. I think that's a little bit of an illusion, but when you really are truly engrossed in a subject, you feel like it sort of populates your entire field of vision because it feels so, as you say, it feels inevitable and urgent.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you mentioned when you have a story that's assigned to you and you kind of have to find like the bit of it to sort of fall in love with. Um, how do you have like a trick for yourself to get excited about a story that maybe you wouldn't be excited about otherwise?
I The simplest way of doing it is just to try to picture myself as a reader for that story and what could draw me to this topic as a reader, and really look at it as an audience member. It I think that that's the most reliable way. It's just a frame of mind where instead of puzzling over it as a writer, you try to step away from it completely and think, why would I read this? What would draw me to read this?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I feel like when I know I'm like this, and I'm sure a lot of writers are like this, when it's that thing of getting really stuck on a piece of writing and feeling like, okay, I just have to sit here and power through and grind it out. And I think 2 or 3 times already, you've sort of reminded us sometimes you got to step away. You got to step away from the piece of writing to see it. You got to step away from your office to get ideas. There's a lot of not writing involved with
Yeah.
writing.
Well, one thing that was very comforting to me was a study that was released some years ago that did say that a huge amount of writing is done not on the page, that it's going on in your head. And sometimes it's going on in pretty deep in your mind, that it's not the thing you're thinking about in the front of your brain, but you're working it out in the back of your brain. I used to always, when I was stuck and had what I interpreted as writer's block, either go for a walk, go for a run, go for a drive, just go away. And besides the fact that it felt like less torture than sitting in front of a blank screen, I really did feel like I needed to just let my mind process. And it felt like I could do that better by not sitting and staring at a screen and doing something that was engaging but not distracting, like walking or running or driving. You can do it sort of automatically. So it wasn't, I wouldn't recommend watching a movie or doing something that really engages your brain, but something monotonous that feels like you are turning off your active brain and letting it work out the problem of trying to figure out how to fix your writing problem.
Right. It's like why those, light bulb moments always happen in the shower or gardening or something, right?
Right.
There've been studies. I love you said what you interpreted as writer's block. Do you believe in writer's block? Do you, you're
No,
so creative.
I
Do you ever
actually,
have wrote block?
I don't believe, first of all, I don't even like saying it because I feel like you, um, you manifest things by naming them. And even though that's a little bit of superstition, I feel like it's my superstition, so I'm going to stick with it. Um, but I also feel like um, I interpret it differently. I think that what writer's block feels like you don't know how to say something, but what it really is you don't know what you're trying to say. That the problem isn't finding the words to express it, it's that you don't even know what you're trying to say. And that the problem in with a nonfiction piece is usually you need to go and do a little more research. That it's often not a problem of the crafting the sentence, it's that you're not really very clear about the what it is you're trying to express. And that inevitably, if you back up and look at where you are, you're often at a point where your reporting is a little flimsy, and that you need to either go do some more research or you simply need to do more thinking, and that you should stop writing. I mean, I think when you have what you think of as writer's block, you should absolutely stop trying to write. Just stop and analyze, what are you trying to say? And if you can't really say what it is, then chances are you need to do a little more research. If you can say what it is, then you need to think a little more about why. Usually you're trying to say too much in too compact a space, or you've created the problem. I mean, we all get stuck. Everybody gets stuck. You get tired, you're bored, there are many reasons that you run out of steam while you're writing. But I think that the idea that you have this entire beautifully crafted thought in your head, but you simply can't get it on the page, is not the case. I don't think it's fully crafted in your head. I think you have not yet figured out what it is that is trying to come out.
Yeah, I keep thinking of this is a very scholarly book that I'm going to mention, but I don't know if you've ever read The Frog and Toad, where I think it's Frog is trying to write something and he's trying to think of an idea and he's just slamming his head against the wall saying, here's how I'm going to come up with an idea. I feel like actually a lot of us do that. And it's interesting and I think very validating to be reminded that so much of the time you really need to step away and research more and think more. Because
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit of sort of our like deeply ingrained kind of cult of productivity or whatever it is that makes us think, no, it doesn't count if I didn't get the words on the page. I wasn't doing anything.
Yeah, I mean, I feel in my case, it's almost always that I need to do more reporting. It's
Mhm.
almost inevitably that I don't yet have enough material and that I'm trying to write something out of a very thin amount of information. And it's it's sort of a good lesson because you can really wear yourself out if you sit there and you keep trying to, as you say, sort of power through, and you keep writing and throwing the sentences out, and it's a miserable feeling. And usually it doesn't come to any good end. I mean, that is usually not how you fix that problem. The other thing that I've found with writer's block is that sometimes the problem isn't what you are trying to write, it's with what you already wrote, that you wrote yourself into a corner, and that if you back up and, you know, go back a few paragraphs or a few pages, you might find that you really need to redo that, and it's you set yourself up for running into a wall, and that the problem lies a little earlier in the piece.
That's a really good reminder too, that writing, especially with something longer, is almost never really a linear process. You sort of, I sometimes think that people look at a book and say, okay, it happened the way I'm reading it, but really, especially with something longer, it's not how it works.
Right. Well, I think that there's a lot of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And I think if you're doing it right, that should be what's happening. I think that it would be strange to simply move ahead with absolutely no doubling back. I mean, I don't know in the history of the world if that's ever happened with something that was well written.
Yeah.
I think you write a few sentences and then you go back and adjust them and tweak them and redirect them and move forward, and you keep doing that over and over again. And I think that that's progress, but it doesn't look like a line. It looks like a series of loops.
That's right, exactly. Series of loops. I love that. It makes me think about how you've also written that one of your biggest writing challenges is maintaining the confidence that the story is worth telling. How do you sort of trick yourself back into feeling confident about the story being worth telling? How do you think writers can kind of keep that faith?
Well, that's so important and so essential that it's an ongoing challenge, because particularly if you're not writing about war or death or matters that are undeniably urgent, but instead telling stories that you believe have merit, I think the process of writing is 90% confidence. And it might be a little disconcerting to put the percentage that high, but I think it really is. I think you have to believe that you have something to say and the right to say it. And that can be very difficult. I mean, I would say there's no solution to that. The chance is that throughout working on a piece that's not about war or death or, medical urgency, that you will repeatedly question the validity of it. Why would anyone care about this? Why is this important to tell? Why am I the person to tell it? In each case, I think there's a little bit of denial. You have to simply say to yourself, it's important because I've decided it is. I'm the person to tell it because I have chosen this role in society of being a storyteller. It can really be crippling. And, I write stories that I think that all along I myself can be the one to criticize them and say, who cares? Who cares about this? Who cares that a guy stole some orchids? Who cares that a library burned down? And I have to almost, it's a little bit like bungee jumping. I mean, you have to somehow trick yourself into feeling the confidence and saying it's important because I've chosen, because every story is important. And this story has repercussions that are important in this way or that way. And you do have to talk yourself into it. Because every story is important and every story is not important. So it's a matter of sheer willpower that you have to will yourself into believing, even if you just say, my role that I've chosen for myself is to be a storyteller and to tell every story that I have time to tell in my life. And this is a story that I am spending this month telling, that it's neither more important or less important than any other story. It's just the story I'm doing right now. And while that may seem like you're devaluing it, I think what you're doing is removing the onus of importance from it. Because was it important to tell the story about a guy who stole some flowers? No, it wasn't important. But I chose to tell it. So I had to, every time I would lose my nerve, I had to really trick myself into this state of mind that I've decided to anoint myself a storyteller, and this is a story I'm telling right now.
I love that. And it reminds me of something you said just a few minutes ago about picturing yourself as a reader. I feel like when I think about myself as a reader, I don't actually just want to read stories about war and death and medical urgency. I want to read about, your dog being funny. So maybe that's a good trick too. Like, remember, what you actually want to read. Like, you probably actually want to read a book about, an interesting, unusual man who steals kids.
Well, I think part of the trick too is to continually take yourself back to the moment when you decided to do the story. And just remember that it clicked for you. And therefore, it's probably hard to put into words why you felt the chemistry, but you did. And you have to keep bringing yourself back to remembering that there was something that clicked and something that made you feel like this was an important story to tell. And I've done some stories where that was really hard. And I spent a lot of time saying, I did a profile of a 10-year-old boy. It's just a 10-year-old suburban kid. There was nothing special about him. Throughout the time I was working on the story, I kept coming back to the same question: is who cares? He's just a 10-year-old kid living in New Jersey. Why does anyone care about this? And I had to keep thinking, well, I must have thought at the time I pitched the story that it was a good idea. And while I can't remember now why I did think it at the time, I must have really believed in it. And damn it, I'm gonna. And then also, it's like too late now to really analyze it because it's due in 2 weeks. And so I just have to get it done.
Right. It's kind of the weird joy of the deadline at a certain point. You're like, well, I don't really have time for an existential crisis right now. I need to get
Right.
the work in.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a deadline has a very clarifying effect on your mind.
Um, I'm thinking you've been such a prolific writer for Medium, in addition to all the other writing you do. Do you always, how do you know what's a blog post, what's an article, what's a book? Do you know right when you start? And I guess too, how do those different pieces all fit together? Like, that's kind of two questions, but how do you kind of balance your mental energy?
That's a great question because I think there are times when something that began as one thing evolves into something else. But more often, I think you know from the beginning the kind of shape and size of what you're writing. I mean, I've had a few books that began as stories, and while I was working on them, I felt there's just too much to tell in a story. This has to be a book. But more often, I think the difference between a blog and a magazine piece is very clear to me. I think a blog has as at its heart the quality of conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like it is an ongoing conversation with readers that you might jump around in subject matter, but the tone and the sort of heft of the idea is something that feels conversational and that can be addressed in a reasonable amount of time. But more than the length is the tone. It's a bit of a quality of a chat that there's a lot less formal structuring, a lot less context and backstory. I think when you begin looking at a topic where context feels really important, that starts moving into the realm of being a magazine piece. And I think that's probably a fairly good differentiation, that a blog can exist in the moment. A magazine piece, to me, almost always calls for being set in a span of time, that this observation emerges out of some historical context or sociological context that you want to invoke. And something where you begin to feel that there are multiple characters and many layers, not so much length as depth, that begins to feel like a book to me.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting, and I really admire your ability to do all of these. It's like some sort of high wire juggling act to do all these things. I love how you write about sort of the infinite well of creativity, and I'm going to do that weird thing where I quote you to yourself now. Okay, so you wrote this. When I first started writing, I imagined that I was dipping my pen into a finite pool of creative ink. I thought creativity, in my case writing, was something akin to a natural resource like petroleum, limited, precious, unrenewable. It made me nervous. I sized up every assignment I was offered with that scarcity in mind. Was doing this story worth depleting my supply of creative juice? And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that and how you kind of moved away from that feeling. Because I think a lot of writers do feel that way, and that there's like a scarcity mindset when it comes to creativity. Yeah, how did you kind of move away from that conception of your
Well, it was I think when I first started working as a writer, and I did feel that I would be squandering this limited resource if I took assignments that were not top of my list, that were things that I didn't want to do that much. And it was experience over time that made me realize that it's quite the opposite, that the more you use this muscle of, that creativity is a muscle rather than a precious fluid, and that it gets stronger the more you use it. And I think it was getting more experience that made me more sure of that, because I thought, if this is a depletable resource, over time your work would grow less sort of successful because you're like running low. But instead I thought, wow, I think I'm getting better, and I know how to avoid some of these pitfalls, or I have a better kind of grip on my tone, or I know how to write description more efficiently and effectively. And I thought, well, this would belie the idea that this is a limited resource, because if I'm getting better the more I'm doing it, then it stands to reason that this is something that in practice improves, that it gets better. And it's funny, if you look at musical instruments, really precious, you know, Stradivarius violins and so forth, the worst thing to do with them is to not use them. And they actually deteriorate by not being used. And they improve by being handled, being used, being played. I think that is the image that came to mind, and that the proof was seeing my own improvement and thinking that it only made sense if creativity was a muscular attribute that got better and more limber the more you used it.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to use that the next time I get stuck. I'm just going to tell my brain, like, you're a Stradivarius, okay? You got it. You got to be you. I don't know if it's that good, but it might help. You shared some really great writing advice today and on Medium. Some of my favorites are to use note cards, which sounds so simple and is actually so just like useful and also profound the way you write it. How not to freak out about bad reviews, very useful. How not to freak out about running out of ideas. What's the best piece of writing advice anyone's ever given you?
The best piece of advice was given to me by my first editor, my first really good editor. And he broke down the process of writing to me in a way that had never been expressed to me before, which is that it was a 3-part process, that it involved reporting, thinking, and writing. And I think that if you're writing nonfiction, you already know that it involves gathering knowledge and writing. But his point that there was an interim step where you had to think about what you had learned and kind of process it before you wrote was really profound for me. And you know, I think when I was first getting started, the minute I did my reporting, I was ready to sit down and start typing away. And I rarely gave myself that extra moment of thinking, all right, what did I learn? And what do I take away from what I learned? And why am I telling the story? And what did I learn that I didn't think I was going to learn from this? And what's exactly not what I expected? And to go through all of that thinking and exploration before I wrote a single word. And that was, I think about it all the time. I mean, this sort of dovetails with our conversation about writer's block, because he was the one who said, you know, it's not a writing problem, it's a reporting or a thinking problem. And those are the things that we often kind of short shrift because we're so busy picturing ourselves in front of our computers. But sitting in front of a computer is the end result of those other two things. And that is easy to forget, but it's advice that I think about all the time.
Yeah, and weirdly hard to follow, right? Because I think we beat ourselves up like, no, I'm not working right now. I'm not at the desk. It doesn't count.
Yeah,
So after telling so many people's stories over the course of your career, you're writing a memoir now, right?
I am.
What made you decide that it was time?
Um, That's a good question. I'm not sure it's ever time. And I'm so skeptical about the whole notion of memoir that I find it slightly cringy to say that I'm writing a memoir. But
It's a safe
I,
space. We're here for it.
well, I feel like I've had so many interesting experiences in my career. I really have. I've had so many, there's so many backstories to the stories.
Mhm.
And it started to feel like the right moment to kind of gather those in one place and um, pull the curtain back a little bit on the stories that I've written and kind of give some of the backstory. So, and the timing was perfect because it was right at the moment when the pandemic began that I began this project, which was great because I don't have to do a lot of traveling. And if I were doing a story that was more, that involved more reporting, it would have been a real problem.
Yeah, that's a great pandemic writing tip. For
Yeah, do something where you don't have to leave home.
That's right. Um, that's really interesting. I just have one more question for you, which is, um, do you remember that time Meryl Streep played you in a movie?
I don't.
Remember that?
I do. I actually do remember.
Cool. That's all. I have no follow-up questions.
Yeah, yeah. You just want to make sure that I remember.
Just so you know,
I
that's
definitely
pretty
remember.
interesting.
I think that I will never not remember.
Is that how you picture yourself now while you're
Yeah,
writing?
yeah.
Perfect.
No,
Well,
it was definitely a memorable experience, as you might imagine.
I hope there's more about that in the memoir, which I can't wait to read.
Thank you. Well, I'll tell you the biggest challenge that I found so far is convincing myself that it's a story worth telling. I mean, I am confronting the ultimate example of convincing myself that a story is worth telling, because of course I keep looking at it and saying it's just my life, who cares about my life?
Oh, well, someone once gave me some really wise advice about this, which is to picture yourself as a reader and what would interest you in a reader. And also to remind yourself that it's a valid and interesting story because you chose to write it right now. There's a reason. It's very good advice from
Yeah, that
a
sounds
friend.
very, I like that. It has a good ring
Smart.
to it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Susan Orlean. Everybody follow her on Medium to get more just really nonstop wit and wisdom. No pressure, Susan, but she's got it. Don't forget to check out Creators Hub on Medium. We'll be sharing highlights from this talk, and we've published a lot of great writing advice from Susan and other writers. And thanks so much for being here. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you. My pleasure, really.